It's Thursday, September 3rd, 1953, and we're in Kalamazoo, Michigan, riding the end of an oppressive heat wave, the last gasps of a summer that just won't quit. Temperatures have sizzled their way into the 90s for 9 consecutive days, and if there's any solace to be had on this one, at least it's the first day in a few that the mercury hasn't reached the century mark. The South Bend Blue Sox are worn out and exhausted, having played 8 games in 7 days through the worst of the heat wave. They've lost most of them and are dangerously close to being eliminated from playoff contention. Tonight they'll face the Kalamazoo Lassies. The threadbare grounds crew mists the grass with a paltry drink from a garden hose, and as Gene Fout takes the hill, the infield grass is exhaling a layer of steam. The sun dips beyond the horizon, but the earth is not cooled. There aren't many fans in the stands on this night, courtesy of the dwindling popularity of the women's game and the way the oppressive heat seems to focus itself most of all on the town's ballpark. It's too bad. They're going to miss a doozy. Out on the pitcher's mound, Gene Fout recognizes the weight of the moment. She's already decided that she will retire at the end of the season, and if the Blue Sox can't sneak into the playoffs, then the end of the season is just 3 days away. No one else yet knows that she's made her decision, and that her decision is final. Whatever emotions there are to wrestle with, Gene Fout will wrestle with alone. That, and the parade of opposing hitters, each with designs to ruin the star hurler's night. Gene Fout takes a deep breath and looks in at the catcher. If her team doesn't make it to the postseason, this could very well be the last game she ever pitches. And if that's the case, she might as well make it a good one. She makes quick work of the Lassies in the first, striking out the first batter and then coaxing a pair of groundouts to retire the side in order. It goes like this for a while. Routine ground balls fielded with precision, lazy pop flies on the infield. Fout's fastball is jumping, and her breaking balls are snapping off violently, late movement making it almost impossible for hitters to square up the ball. Fout's teammates are used to witnessing mastery on the mound. After all, Fout is the greatest pitcher in the history of their league. She'd once gone an entire season with an ERA less than 1. She holds the record for the best winning percentage by any pitcher ever, man or woman. But by the end of the 5th inning, the Blue Sox begin to become aware that what is happening tonight is special, even for Gene Fout. The Lassies have sent 15 women to the plate, and Gene Fout has sat them all right back down. No one has been safe at first. Only 3 balls have been hit out of the infield, and they've all been caught. There is a superstition in baseball that requires a team to shun its pitcher during the course of a no-hitter. It's considered a jinx to so much as mention what's happening until it's over. Consigned to one side of a dugout bench while the rest of her teammates squeeze on to the other end, Gene Fout sits solitary and focused. If she was alone with everything she was carrying before the game, she is somehow more alone now. She retires the side in the 6th, striking out 2 of them. It's in the 7th inning that the chatter and buzz in the stands begins to build, even among the depleted crowd. It's not until the 8th that the home fans turn against their own team, rooting now to see history even more than they are rooting for a Lassie's victory. It's at least 40 minutes now since Gene Fout has spoken a word to anyone, and now it's the 9th inning, and still no one has reached base. The first hitter knocks a weak grounder back toward the pitcher. Fout fields it herself and tosses to first for the 25th consecutive out of the game. The ball travels around the horn before finding its way back into Gene Fout's glove. She takes a breath, whines, and fires. Another routine grounder, this one back to the shortstop, thrown to the first baseman, and then the ritual is repeated. 26 up and 26 down, 1 more to go. The last batter will go down as easy as any of them. A lazy fly ball in foul territory, an easy catch for the third baseman who tucks the ball safely into her glove, And when the game is over, the fracas is on. Players descend on the mound, throwing gloves in the air and caution to the wind. They jump their pitcher in a steaming, sweating pile. Fans once hostile stand and applaud, an ovation that makes up in length what it lacks in numbers. Jean Fout has just thrown a perfect game, the second in her career. For at least the next 70 years, she will be the only professional baseball player, man or woman, at any level, in any league, in any nation in the world, to have 2 perfect games to her name. Jean Fout will go out on top, as if there was ever any other way she could have gone. Hello and welcome to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Helman, and during this series, we are going to dive into the history of the South Bend Blue Sox, possibly the most storied franchise in the brief but shining history of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. During the course of this episode, you'll hear fictional advertisements for very real historical companies and products. We do that to help break up the podcast, provide some levity, to include just a little more history than we could otherwise, and to give you a sense of the time and place when and where all of this is happening. The absence of actual paid advertising is made possible by the generous underwriting of the entire series by the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League Players Association. And with all of that out of the way, let's jump into the final years of the South Bend Blue Sox, and let's explore plenty more history than just that magical perfect game in Kalamazoo. The Blue Sox Dutiful Dozen had won the 1952 championship with long odds, down several starters and armed with just 12 players during their playoff run. But if winning 5 playoff games with that kind of a squad is unlikely, then enduring a 110-game regular season is impossible. Between the player walkout and the inevitable retirements of some of the team's key contributors from that playoff run, Carl Winch and the Blue Sox brass found themselves with half a baseball team ahead of the 1953 campaign. They would have to scramble to fill in the pieces, and it would prove to be a difficult challenge. The league's tryouts attracted record low numbers of aspirational ball players. In part, it was because the pool of women who wanted to play professional baseball was pretty small, and most of the eligible candidates were already in the league. But there was also the unavoidable truth that the women's game was sliding into insolvency, if it hadn't already. Female ball players were loath to put their lives on hold to play in a league that might not even survive to the All-Star break. At the same time, the league was continuing to tinker with the rules. They introduced a smaller ball, stretched out the distance between the pitching mound and home plate, lengthened the base paths. This version of baseball was within inches of the men's game, but because they were behind financially, the league introduced the new rules with a miser's touch, announcing that they would only switch over to the newer, smaller ball after their supply of the current balls ran out. That meant that teams and pitchers worked and trained and played with one style of baseball until suddenly they didn't. The results were predictably awful. In the weeks after the new ball was introduced, players struggled to adapt. An early contest in the small ball era featured 30 walks, 6 errors, and 5 passed balls. The newspaper called it a baby track meet. For a league struggling to stay afloat, misguided rule changes had the effect of making their on-field product worse. In an attempt to persuade the public of the level of play in the women's league, officials arranged hasty exhibitions against local men's teams, high school squads, and even a few games against men's old-timer squads. The move backfired when the women lost the first batch of these exhibitions, and the second batch was quickly canceled. When a series of early season injuries took out the few veterans the Blue Sox had left, the play only got sloppier. Voices long skeptical of the women's game had been silenced by the high-quality play of the league's earliest years, but those voices were back with a vengeance, and there were days when it seemed like they had a point. When we get back from the break, South Bend tries to win over its fans all over again.
This Friday night, Playland Park is where you want to be for action, thrills, and most of all, speed. The Northern Indiana Stock Car Racing Association presents time trials at 7 o'clock and races at 8:15. All the racers are big-name drivers, so come out as we christen our brand-new quarter-mile asphalt track. And now back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
The issues that plagued the Blue Sox in 1952 were still present with the team in 1953, namely in the form of a massive understanding gap between the team's players and its surly manager Carl Winch. Winch was a poor communicator, and according to players on the team, he offered them very little instruction during practices. Winch seemed to believe that the manager's job was only one as the team's chief tactician, setting lineups, calling steals, and pulling levers during the games. But unlike major league teams, Winch didn't have a coaching staff to do the other tasks. He was the only one who could teach the newcomers the finer points of infield defense and stealing bases. But he didn't. He called the shots during the games and left the weight of teaching baseball to his veterans, mostly Gene Fout. The results were not good, and the 1953 season was a disaster for the Blue Sox in every possible way. They were not good on defense. They were not good on offense. Well, except Gene Fout, who would take home her second MVP in the 1953 season, the lone star on a subpar team that missed the playoffs. Things were just as bad in the team's boardroom. They had slashed costs across the board in an attempt to break even financially. Those moves contributed to the worsening of their team, but at least they had a plan. If they could average a home attendance of 1,000 fans per game, they would break even. They didn't come particularly close. The newspapers wrote in disparaging ways about the state of the women's game. Whatever novelty it had in the first place was worn off, and the product on the field was suffering, courtesy of ill-fated rule changes, penny pinching, and a player pool that had been diminishing one season over another. There was an argument to be made that the women on the field were doing everything they could, and that the greatest mistakes were made by the men, and they were exclusively men running the league. But in the pages of the newspapers, that argument was never made. At some point during the season, Gene Fout realized the game just wasn't as fun anymore. Fout had come up in 1946 when the team filled stadiums and were greeted like heroines whenever they returned to South Bend from a road trip. The women she played with were gritty gamers who knew ball. It was all different now, and not for the better. Besides that, Winch was still her husband, and her entire life was unpleasant because of it. So Gene Fout, the greatest player in the history of the league, walked away from the sport she'd loved, and at the peak of her powers. She pitched that perfect game, then spent a final weekend at Playland Park, soaking up the adoration of the fans who had always seen her as superhuman, and then it was over, the end of an era. The next year would bring the end of everything. It was February of 1953 when the league voted to suspend operations, but they repented of that decision a few weeks later and committed to at least one more season, this one with just 5 teams, in Fort Wayne, Kalamazoo, Rockford, South Bend, and Grand Rapids. The South Bend Blue Sox and the Rockford Peaches were the only holdovers from the league's inaugural season, the only ones to play all 12 years of the circuit's history. For the women of the All-American League, there were difficult decisions to make. The league would end soon, and they all knew it. The game paid well enough during the season, but it paid nothing in the off-season. There were veterans who'd given their 20s to the game, postponed careers and families. At some point, they were going to have to move on, and it might be more beneficial to do so on their own terms. Teams got creative about how they would coax one more year of ball out of their players. South Bend carried at least one player who would only play in home games. She would not need to travel with the team and could spend that time with her family instead. When the deal was struck, there was some hope that Gene Fout might return under similar circumstances, but as long as Winch was the manager, she wouldn't budge. The team even tried to re-sign Pee Wee Wiley to a roster spot, a player Winch had once tossed from the team for the sin of excessive sarcasm. Wiley retired rather than play for Winch. If the board of directors ever considered moving on from their controversial skipper, there's no record of it. Anyway, the men were usually far more loyal to each other than to the women on the diamond. And besides that, it was true that Winch was just 1 year separated from having led his team to back-to-back championships. At the same time, the team needed good players, and the good players they could find didn't want to play for him. A list that I feel like I need to iterate again included the greatest player in the history of the league and his own wife. But the decision was made to stick with Winch, and the team he had was the team that would play out the last season in the history of the league. Even though the decision to end the circuit wasn't officially made until after the season was over, almost everyone knew it was coming. The players, the managers, even the fans, they treated the 1954 season like it was the last dance. As for the goings-on of that season, details are sparse. The Tribune stopped assigning reporters to cover away games, and the column inches for the home games grew shorter. A game recap might include a score and a winning pitcher. If Carl Winch got thrown out for verbally assaulting an umpire, that would get a write-up too. The hardships that visited the Blue Sox visited every other team in the league too, and heading into the last week of the season, South Bend found itself in second place, riding the coattails of hurler Janet Rumsley, the season's top pitcher, and the author of an August no-hitter. Already assured of a playoff spot, the Blue Sox marched into the last game of the regular season needing a win to secure second place. A loss would drop them into third. The final regular season game in the history of the franchise would prove to be the ugliest dud the team ever produced. But it's hard to blame the whole team for this one. When Carl Winch disagreed with a third-inning balk call, he charged the umpire and said his piece. The umpire ejected him, and Winch refused to leave the field for some number of minutes. 15 minutes after the tantrum started, the umpire had had enough. He waved his arms and declared the contest a forfeit. It was the largest paid attendance Playland Park had seen all season, and they were treated to 2 innings of baseball before being sent home, booing Winch all the way out. Carl Winch was fined $10 for his display, but he refused to pay it. The league declared he would be suspended until he made good on his debt. On the eve of the beginning of the playoffs, he still hadn't. In 1952, the Blue Sox went into the playoffs without a third of their team. Now in 1954, they were going in without a manager. Winch would never manage another game at Playland Park. His last act in South Bend was that tantrum near the corner of Lincoln Way and Ironwood. For fans and historians, the only solace is that the forfeit wasn't the last game in the history of the franchise. At least there were still the playoffs. And when we get back from the break, the South Bend Blue Sox will chase down their last hurrah.
Mr. Family Fun says only South Bend Croquet has a knurled and grooved ball. Made of seasoned rock maple, these balls roll straighter and more accurate, and the paint won't mar as easily. With 13 models of croquet sets, South Bend Toy has something for everyone. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
The Blue Sox limped into the first round of the playoffs on August 28, 1954, with a home game against the Kalamazoo Lassies, the first tilt of the 3-game series. It was a win at Playland Park, a 6-3 drubbing that might have washed the bitter taste of the previous game from fans' mouths. Then it was off to Kalamazoo. Winch begrudgingly paid his fine and returned to skipper the team for the 2 away games of the series. If there was to be any more baseball in Playland Park, Winch would need to find a way to win one of the pair on the road. He didn't, and there wasn't. They lost 6-3 and 10-7. The last play in the history of the franchise was a ground ball off of the bat of Mary Wimp Baumgartner, the team's backup catcher. It was an easy play for the Lassies, And when the first base umpire raised his fist, it was the end of the season and the end of the franchise. Baumgartner remembered the season this way. By 1954, the caliber of play wasn't there anymore. Everyone knew it was the final season. And it was. At the end of 12 seasons, the lights went out on the All-American League for the last time. The Blue Sox finished with 2 championships and an all-time record of 717 wins against 605 losses. No team in the league had more wins than that. Hey, thanks for joining us on A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org, and if you want to know anything else about the All-American League, the History Museum should be your first stop. The History Museum serves as the national repository for the AAGPBL Players Association. I'm your host, Aaron Helman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. Tune in for our next episode as we visit the long and lasting legacy of the All-American League and the South Bend Blue Sox. Thanks again for listening. Keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.